Hello! Welcome to another lecture from David Panush of the Edmund Burke School on Robert Wright's The Moral Animal. We're doing the second part of Chapter 12 about social status. It's a pretty short second part of the chapter, so shouldn't be too long. Picking up where we left off, Wright goes into a discussion of the role of friends in the social hierarchy. So as you recall, social hierarchy is any organization of individuals. We are in social hierarchies everywhere we go, whenever we interact with other human beings. Our classroom is a social hierarchy, our family is a social hierarchy, our entire society is a social hierarchy. So within the social hierarchy, friends cooperate with us and share resources with us, just as we learned in the last unit on reciprocal altruism. That's the definition of a friend, somebody that you can have a reciprocally altruistic relationship with that you keep up over time. And now that we have the lens of the social hierarchy to look at friendship a little more closely, one of the things that we can talk about is how status comes into this idea of friendship. Status itself is a resource. It's something that can be shared between two people. And to some degree, it is a non-zero-sum resource. And as we talked about in the last unit, anything that is non-zero-sum can be shared among friends and can be a resource that contributes to a friendship and reciprocal altruistic relationship. So Wright goes so far as to say that status assistance is the main purpose of friendship among human beings. So in our last chapter, we were mostly talking about sharing resources or sharing knowledge, but in this case, we're talking about sharing status. And so if you think about this idea, where does status come from? To some degree, it comes from who you associate with. If you are friends with people who have high status, generally speaking, you have high status. If you are friends with people who associate with people who generally have low status, then you generally have low status. So when you combine these ideas of what does it mean to be a friend and then who are you friends with and how does that affect your status, this gets us to this idea that status is a resource that can be shared among friends. Obviously at the very, very top, there's only so much you can share, but at most places in the hierarchy you can share status with your friends. In other words, if you're cool, they're cool, and vice versa. Taking this a step further, we know that friends tend to get together with more friends and become groups. And then we've got groups of friends competing for status. Because if one friend group is at the higher part of the hierarchy, then everybody in that group succeeds in the hierarchy. And if one friend group is at the lower end of that hierarchy, then they're going to be less successful. So we get competition between groups, not just individuals, when it comes to our thinking about competing for status. And this gives rise, Wright sort of theorizes, to the whole human idea of in-groups and out-groups, which is very densely ingrained into us, and we'll talk more about it later in the course, where we tend to see those who are in our group as better than those who are out of our group. And it's a simple reflection upon ourselves, because remember, those who are in our group, their status reflects our status. So of course we want to think well of them, and those that we're competing with, we think less well of. On a larger level, this sort of coming from the micro level of just friends competing, individuals competing for status, and then sort of banding together in groups competing for status, we have the idea of nationalism, entire nations banding together to say our identity, our status is built upon our identity as a nation, and it must be better than this other nation. All kinds of fanaticisms and all kinds of racisms and sexisms, where my group, by virtue of me and my status being important, has to be better than this other group. So this is sort of trying to explain the root of a lot of these in-group, out-group competitions and isms that are generally destructive. But of course, within the group, it can be productive. Wright goes on to talk about where and whom in the hierarchy are we most competitive with, are we most concerned with, and he He uses this phrase that you may have heard or may not be familiar with called keeping up with the Joneses. So it comes from this basic idea that, maybe in the 50s, everybody's living in houses that all look the same in the same version of suburbia. And the folks next door, their house, those folks, they're the Joneses. And so, maybe they put a rose garden in the front of their lawn, and then you have to put, a tulip garden in front of your house to keep up with the Joneses. Or they get the brand new Buick, so you have to get the brand new Chevy that's a little better than the Buick. So it's this idea that you're keeping up with the Joneses. You're most concerned in the social hierarchy with those closest to you, your neighbors, literally and sort of figuratively. So why is it that you are not as concerned with the folks maybe far away from you or less close to you in the hierarchy? To some degree, you're not competing with them. I mean, it's a hierarchy, which means that you sort of have a ladder that you move up and down, and the way you move up and down is by sort of competing for status with those closest to you. I can only go up 1 or 2 steps at a time, and I can only go down 1 or 2 steps at a time. So those below me are trying to get what I got, and I'm trying to get above the people right above me. But you're not really competing with the folks way, way, way at the top. You don't have what it takes to compete with them, and you're not really competing with the folks way, way, way at the bottom. So that's this idea of keeping up with the Joneses. These last 2 ideas are intertwined, and I actually went back and forth as to which one I'll introduce first. But I'm going to talk about conformity to values and social norms first, because I think it's a little, it leads into the other one a little bit better. So within a group, whether it's, again, a family, a classroom, a club, a team, an entire nation, there are cultural norms and values that define what is acceptable in that group. So these are, you must do this, or you should do this, or you shouldn't do that, and you shouldn't do this. And these are basically the morals that we've been talking about in the entire course. Generally speaking, these values and norms are set, these trends even, if you will, are set by the folks at the top, because they are the ones with status. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. Maybe they got the status by having these ideals that we all look up to in the first place. But when they're at that point, they can set trends. And so yes, we pay attention to those at the top because they're setting the norms for what is acceptable in our society. And here's the basic gist of it. If we conform to the norms in our society, we can belong to that society. And if we do it really, really well, whatever the ideal is, then we can move up in status. But if we don't conform to whatever it is our society values, then we're going to move down in status. So this idea that we talk about sometimes as being, conformist, which means going along with what everybody else is doing, it has both a positive and a negative connotation. But in this case, the positive connotation is it's how you belong to the group. It's how you are moved up in the group. And remember, in the evolutionary environment, the worst thing that could probably happen to you was to be shunned out of the group entirely. So you had to learn to conform to the social norms of the group that you're in. So what are the social norms in each group? They're totally infinitely variable. So we can talk about it as like a currency, or what defines status in each group. It's going to be different in different cultures. It's going to be different in different groups, different times, different societies. This is evolutionarily useful to us. If we had evolved only to have one idea of what's valuable, or one idea of one way to behave that had no ability to adapt, then we wouldn't be able to adapt to different times or different changes in the environment. Maybe, we were a hunter-gatherer society, and then all of a sudden the environment changes, so there's a different way of gathering resources that could be really useful. Well, we've got to be able to adapt our cultural norms to do that new thing. So we know that, the behaviors that might gain you status in one group might not gain you status in another group. So, going back to the last slide, you've got to figure out what the norms are and the values are in the groups that you're in, and then, in terms of gaining status, you have to conform. So you either figure out what to do or what not to do in that group to be accepted and gain status. Your other choices, if you get enough power, are to redefine the norms themselves. So maybe you rise to a point within a group where you can set new trends, or you can say this isn't okay, or this is not, this is what we do now. And we talk about that. It's how you define a culture. And if enough people in the culture start to say, no, this is how we do this thing now, then you've redefined the norms. And so now, by non-conforming, but you've got enough of a coalition, you can redefine a new norm. The other strategy is to leave the group entirely. So if you're in a group and the way that they expect you to act and behave isn't working for you, or you can't compete in that group, you can go to another group. You can leave that group. We have more choices in this regard than others. And chances are you would want to seek out a group that valued your contributions and your skills and talents more than the one that you're currently in. And to some degree, this is what you all will be doing next fall when you go off to college. So thank you for listening. As always, read the book. You'll gain a lot more understanding than this brief talk. Answer the questions in the homework. See me if you have questions.